So welcome to the Aurora Institute's session today. Thanks so much for joining us. My name's Elliot Levine, and I'm the research director at the Aurora Institute, and I will be moderating today's session on taking an equity-based approach to advancing a research and learning agenda. My slides aren't switching. Let's see if I can figure out why. There we go. All right. As you may know, we hold a major event every October called the Aurora Institute Symposium. And this year we're shifting it to a virtual symposium that will take place October 26th through 28th. So please save the date and watch for more information that we'll be sending soon. We're also hosting a series of more than 20 virtual sessions in the months before and after the symposium. And today is the first of those sessions. And it's part of a series of research sessions that are focused on building the evidence base for personalized learning. Again, we welcome you to use the chat box as one way that we can get to know each other and learn from each other. As I've already said, if you're just joining us, you can use the chat box to introduce yourself. And you can also use it anytime during the session to ask questions, add comments, or share insights based on your experience and the work you do. We also encourage you to share insights from the webinar on Twitter using hashtag Aurora 2020 and also mention our handle at Aurora Institute. The slides and video we'll be emailing to you in a few days, links to the slides and the video, and we'll send you an email about that soon. Today, we're very fortunate to have two presenters from City Year who are deeply involved with building the evidence base for personalized learning. And City Year partners with public schools in dozens of high-need communities across the United States and internationally, and their teams provide crucial supports to help students stay on track to graduate from high school. Jessica Prowitt is the Director of External Evaluation at City Year, and Jade Eccles is an Education Research Fellow at City Year. Jessica and Jade, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll turn it over to you to get us started.
Thank you for that introduction. I really appreciate it. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Aurora Symposium presentation on taking an equity-based approach to advancing a research and learning agenda. I appreciate you all for coming. So moving on to the next slide, please. We just want to talk about online meeting norms briefly. We'd love if you could have your camera on. You can update your name label with your pronouns if you feel comfortable doing so, but this is very optional. Please use the chat throughout our presentation. Please keep yourself on mute when you're not speaking. I'll be keeping myself on mute as well whenever possible because unfortunately my smoke alarm is broken and it makes noise. So apologies in advance if it's distracting in any way. So moving on to the next slide, please. So before my colleague Jessica and I further introduce ourselves, I want to give you some more context about City Year. So it's an education nonprofit. Since its inception in 1988, we've invested ourselves in serving low-income students in systemically under-resourced schools by providing holistic supports through a whole school, whole child approach. So we operate in 29 cities and 21 states across the country. We assign teams of 8 to 15 AmeriCorps members who are ages 18 to 25 in schools to serve as near-peer mentors to students. So core members work with teachers in classrooms to cultivate the potential and promise of every child through academic tutoring, social and emotional skill building, and more. So now on to the introductions. So as was stated before, my name is Jade Eccles. Oh, next slide, please. My name is Jade Eccles. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Education Research Fellow, as Elliot said. I started working with City Year in September of last year, so it's almost been a year, and I'm based in Providence, Rhode Island. So next, let's meet my co-presenter.
Hi, my name is Jessica Prowitt. Thank you, Jade. I am the external director, I'm Director of External Evaluation at City Year, I've been with City Year for 3 years, and before that I was a teacher for about 9 years, ending in a school that had City Year. So I'm excited to be here with you all today, honored to see so many experts in the chat as well, especially since this is going to be a collaborative presentation. I'm really looking forward to hearing from you all and getting to know all of you a little more. Next slide, please. So for the purpose and goals for today's presentation and session, we would love to, one, discuss how best to ensure research implementation remains equity focused by exploring 6 current studies focused on whole child approaches to strengthening student engagement and academic success. And 2, we'd really love, as I mentioned, to collaborate with you all on imagining a future that ensures an equity-based approach to learning, specifically about best practices in personalized learning. Next slide, please. So policy, when done well, emerges from insights about practice, and it's important to get research right so that we're drawing the right lessons and conclusions. And an equity-based approach to research matters because it ensures that the research will benefit everyone. Research that doesn't involve community voices will lack nuance, value, and accuracy, and can even cause harm to communities. The purpose for equity is because it will dramatically increase the likelihood of the findings being used to make change. We want the power of scientific expertise to work for our communities, not on our communities. And their co-ownership in shaping a learning agenda increases their ownership of the results because they know it's responsive to their self-identified priorities. Having the results shared among community stakeholders bolsters their advocacy for changes with their local decision makers and helps to align stakeholders on policy change. Next slide, please. So since we'll be doing some collaborative work today, we wanted to also take a moment to center on some working agreements first. So I'll invite you to use the chat in a minute to contribute to this. But as we've been making intentional shifts in our organization towards equity-based research, we acknowledge that we're on a learning journey. And as such, we invite all of you to join in with your thoughts and feedback today. So a few working agreements that we added are what's said here stays here, what's learned here leaves here, own your learning, and step up, step back, which that third one really refers to the participation space. If you typically like to step back and not contribute in calls like this, we really challenge you to use the chat box a little more, share your thoughts with us. And similar, if you're somebody that likes to participate a lot, verbally, maybe also use the chat box and allow others to take up space if we're having a group conversation, which we hope to have later on. So would love to give you a couple of minutes right now to add anything in the chat box for working agreements you might like to add on your end for collaborative calls. And I'm not seeing anything added in the chat box. One that I always like to add is to expect and accept non-closure, especially with a topic like this. This is something that we're really on a learning journey with, and there's always layers to go deeper when it comes to equity. So just acknowledging that, okay, I see growth mindset, appreciate everyone's input, presume positive intentions. Yes, love all of those. Discomfort is okay, absolutely, especially when we're talking about how to shift current structures to make them more equity-based. Appreciate the learning focus. Thank you. Jade, I'll turn it over to you for the next slide here for context for today's session. So next slide, please.
Thank you, Jessica. So before diving into our core content, I just want to state that the overarching fact underlying this presentation is that research and practice are inextricably connected. So at City Year, we leverage existing research and conduct our own research and evaluation work to ultimately advance continuous learning and improvement. As Jessica said, we're on a learning journey to build evidence of impact and to inform systemic change ultimately. Next slide, please. Moving on to the agenda. After this, we'll be doing a warm-up. We'll then discuss City Year's equity-based approach to research and do a related reading activity. Next, we're going to explore 6 current city or research projects and do a related reflection activity where hopefully we'll get to hear more about your work. And then lastly, we'll engage in resource sharing, a Q&A, and then close the session. So now on the next slide, it's time for a warm-up. So this activity is called 4 Corners. So I'm going to be reading a statement on the slide. You can agree, strongly disagree, or strongly agree, disagree, or strongly disagree with the statement that I read. So after I read the statement, I want you to demonstrate your opinion using the Zoom annotation tools. So using these tools, you can place an arrow or a check mark or any other stamp in the box that best reflects that opinion. So to access the annotation tools, you can go to the top of your screen and click View Options, and then click Annotate. Has everyone been able to navigate to annotate? You can give me a thumbs up if you have. Perfect. And then you can click Stamp and then choose a symbol. So then after I read each statement, you just click the screen to place the symbol in your chosen box. And if you're having trouble with the annotation tools in any way, definitely just feel free to type your opinion on the statement in the chat. So let's get started. I like pineapple on pizza. Put a symbol in your chosen box. Okay. This is typically a divisive one. Okay, perfect. Mint chocolate chip is the best ice cream flavor. Interesting. Okay. Research and evaluation are integral parts of the work that I do. Okay. I'm familiar with the concept of equity-based research. Okay. I've been a part of equity-based research. Lastly, I practice continuous improvement in my work. Okay, that was great. Thank you all for your participation. It's just really helpful for us to get a lay of the land and see what kind of participants are on the call and what your experiences are. I really appreciate that. So next slide.
Quickly, I think Jessica, if everybody could click clear also. I'm realizing I don't have the capabilities to do that. So it's up in that. Perfect. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Jessica. Okay. So next we're going to be talking about our equity-based approach, and we're going to be going over current research projects. Next slide, please. So first of all, we really just want to say, as we said, we've been on a learning journey in our pursuit of centering equity in research. So that means we've been learning a lot from other leaders in the field, and we really want to credit them for their invaluable insights. So for example, when we at City Year saw Chicago Beyond's work, it really gave us a roadmap for what constitutes equity in research. Chicago Beyond has had a huge impact on how we've been thinking about this work. So one resource specifically, which has contributed greatly to our approach, is Chicago Beyond's paper on the 7 inequities in research and how to address them. So these inequities are access, information, validity, ownership, value, accountability, and authorship. So we're going to dive deeply into these inequities later, so I won't go too much into it right now. We've also consulted with an organization called Child Trends. So Child Trends emphasizes that it's important to reject the notion that white is default. We sought guidance from them on how to embed a racial and ethnic equity perspective into research. And we found that conducting research with an equity lens gleans more accurate findings that reflect the lived experiences of students of color, which leads to policy decision-making that actually addresses structural inequalities. And then lastly, the Equitable Evaluation Initiative has provided invaluable information on how to keep equity at the center of research, particularly in the wake of COVID. So on the next slide, we just want to make clear how we're defining an equity-based approach, and this definition comes from Chicago Beyond. So they define an equity-based approach to research as meaning that the creation of research begins from a place of mutual understanding among community organizations, researchers, and funders. So those involved in the research design must recognize unintended bias to arrive at an authentic trust that does the most good for those being researched. Next slide, please. So we've already briefly touched on why taking an equity-based approach is important, and we're going to talk about how to do so in the next couple of slides. But just to expand on our previous comments, our impetus for really taking this approach stems from concern about the history of the research community being dominated by primarily white researchers conducting evaluations that too often objectify individuals of color and low-income communities, but don't subjectify them. There's also perception that evaluation is about judgment as opposed to learning and growth. So soon we'll be discussing how City Year seeks to address these historical concerns through our own equity-based approach. Next slide, please. So here are these 7 pitfalls that I referenced before. So when we were thinking about the how of this work, we've kept these common pitfalls in mind. So this list is based on the work of Chicago Beyond. We're doing an activity later that talks about how these pitfalls will show up in our work. So major barriers to an equity-based approach are the community lacking decision-making power, lack of community access to information, lack of authority and ownership over data for research participants, research actually lacking value for the participants rather than just the researchers, lack of accountability for researchers, and unchecked researcher bias. So now I want to pose a question. Do you feel that any of these pitfalls show up in your own work? And if so, how? I would love if you could type some reflections in the chat. Does anyone have any thoughts? Okay, somebody said the accountability issue has come up. Accountability and validity. Wow, so I'm definitely seeing a trend. Accountability and validity are coming up a lot. Community access and engagement. Research not making it to the community in a digestible form. That's huge. We're going to touch on something similar to that later. Community access and ownership. The standardized testing environment. Sharing the findings back. Somebody said they're looking forward to specific examples. They want to see specific examples. Hopefully we will be getting there soon with an activity. Thank you for your responses. These are great and right on point. So next, we're going to be diving into an activity on the next slide. So we're going to read a document that outlines City Year's protocol for equity-based research. This document was shared as a pre-read for the session, but if you don't have it, I'm going to put a link in the chat right now. Everyone should have received that. So during this portion of the presentation, I want you to read this document on taking an equity-based approach individually. So as you're reading, I want you to think about 3 things. So I want you to note things you have questions about, things that are surprising to you, or things that you feel like you already know, or your organization maybe is already doing. So we're going to give you about 5 minutes to review this document on your own, and then once we come back together, you can verbally share your thoughts or type reflections in the chat. And the share out portion will be a couple of minutes. Does this make sense to everyone? Give me a thumbs up. Great, perfect. Let's say that we come back together at 26 past the hour. Does that sound good? Great, let's get started. Okay, it seems like time is up. So again, the three prompts were questions you had, surprising things, or things you feel like you already knew. So if somebody has a question, I would love to hear a question that somebody had about this document after reading it. Well, I see that somebody appreciated that we request an equity statement as part of the RFP process. Thank you. Another particular point that stood out to people was ensuring that the research team reflects the community being studied. What types of people make up the Equity Council? Okay, there's a lot of questions coming in. Jessica, I'll pivot to you regarding what types of people make up the Equity Council. I think you can speak to that better.
Yeah, happy to. And then we're hopefully going to have time for a Q&A at the end too, if we don't get to all the questions right now. But in terms of who makes up our Equity Council, we have a lot of internal teams that have collaborated to nominate different people to join an Equity Council. So it's a cross-departmental group, a working group that meets within our organization. If you're trying to transfer something similar into your organization, it's an optional thing that people submit to and then become part of a group that meets once a month on equity topics specifically, and then advises to groups in the organization based on topics of equity as they come up. So it was the perfect working group for us to go to with our research in this way. But it's a wide range of people, from AmeriCorps members all the way up to directors and above in our organization.
Someone else asked, what is an equity statement? My understanding is that in the RFP process, it's a required blurb paragraph stating that the researcher is aware of basically the historical power dynamic between researchers and research participants, and they're actively engaged in trying to break down that power dynamic. Jessica, would you like to add to that?
No, that was a great encapsulation. I think it's about having those conversations from the outset and making sure that organizations that we work with are aligned in priorities, and that can look different based on the situation, but it is requesting a statement of agreement on those topics.
Someone else asked, how do you hold yourselves accountable to these? That's an excellent question, and that's something that we're really actually still trying to grapple with. So that's very much a question that we're still answering.
Yeah, we very much value continuous improvement cycles, and so we run those every year. We take a lot of feedback from people who are involved in the implementation stage of our evaluations and reflect on that and have quarterly step backs where we make adjustments. And this is, as I said, going to be an ongoing process, as there's always layers to go deeper. But we do really try to take a continuous improvement framework as we approach this work.
Okay, there are so many questions, and I don't think we can answer them all during this portion. As Jessica said, we will likely be able to answer most of these in the Q&A section at the end. And I think I'll pivot to you, Jessica, for the next section now.
Great. Could we switch to the next slide? Thank you. So next we'll be doing another activity after this, where we mention some of our learnings from our research projects. So first I wanted to go over some of our current research projects that we've connected to this work to give you an idea of where we are leaning in this space. So our 6 evaluations that are ongoing are listed here. I'll just give a brief summary of each before we go on to the next slide. So our partnership with AIR and MDRC is a study that's funded by IES, and it is an RCT and quasi-experimental design that assesses our impact of our whole school, whole child model. And it's a student and school-wide look at SEL and academic outcomes. And then next, our partnership with SEARCH is a qualitative and quantitative analysis of the correlation between developmental relationships and student outcomes. And with PSA, Policy Study Associates there, the third one, it's a comparison of city or partner schools and non-partner schools. Our TI is looking at the effectiveness of our after-school programming, which is one of the 6 components of our whole school, whole child model. And then the Everyone Graduate Center work is ongoing. We recently completed phase 1 of a study with them that validates our holistic approach by proving a correlation between an increase in SEL skills linked to an increase in academic outcomes, and that the more time students spend with our AmeriCorps members who are near peer mentors and student success coaches, the better the outcomes. So these results were published in May of this year and were statistically significant with an enhanced impact in the 9th grade. And we're about to launch into phase 2 of this work to look deeper at the practices connected to these findings, specifically in the areas of relationship development as related to personalized learning and learning environments. And then last on the list here is we're working with Mindset and Motivation Consulting to conduct a qualitative analysis on how City Year has transitioned to supporting personalized learning in the virtual space during COVID. And this has proved to be very interesting as well. So on the next slide, we're going to go into an activity where we're going to model showing you green, yellow, red in some of the areas of equity-based research related to these projects where we feel that we're trying to problem solve and create solutions for the challenges we mentioned earlier related to those 7 inequities. So if you could go on to the next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. So here, I first want to mention that our work on that qualitative project, the last project I mentioned, represents a lot of the ways in which we practice equity-based research. From the initial stages of that research, we foregrounded site voice, site leadership in Memphis, Columbus, and LA, co-created research questions and protocols in collaboration with HQ staff and our external research partner. And throughout the study, we've worked with site leadership as partners in a flexible, open, and collaborative way. And in the wake of COVID-19, we've been intentional about prioritizing site needs and adjusting research processes as we go to best serve them during this difficult time. And we've also pivoted the focus of the research to capture the practices and tools that aided in the transition to virtual learning after COVID-19. So above, you'll see some examples here that reflect City Year's own learning journey and model what we want participants to do in this next activity. On the next slide, where we'll ask you to also identify problems and solutions in those 3 categories. Thanks, Elliot. If you could go back to the previous slide, though, I want to go over some of our solutions. Thank you. So in the first column there, you can see that an area that we feel like we've figured things out pretty well is in incorporating community feedback and creation of research questions and study design. As I mentioned, we very intentionally co-created research questions and protocols from the outset of that qualitative study, which has just increased buy-in and facilitated the work on the implementation side in many ways. In the middle there, though, you'll see where we're still fine-tuning is in collaborating with research partners who are equity-based to ensure implementation remains equity-based. There were a lot of good questions previously about that, but what we have done to mitigate this challenge is conduct a detailed RFP with partners that includes equity-based research questions. And then once we decide to work with a partner, we ensure that we have regular check-in meetings with partners on the work, and so that we can advocate for equity-based research throughout the entire process, especially as it relates to implementation, and adjust as we see challenges come up in that space. So the regular check-ins are important. And then An area where we're feeling stuck. So I would really invite you to type in the chat if you're experiencing something similar or have had any solutions to share. Please do. We'll also leave time in a few minutes after this next activity to invite others to share out. But an area where we're feeling stuck is in the area of access, that inequity challenge, community access to information in specific. And there are a couple of things that make this really challenging for us. One is capacity issues on the city end, not having the time to dedicate to extensive community outreach, which takes time and effort and intentionality, which we try our best, but capacity does become an issue. And then second, access of information about the study. And that's specifically accessibility to families at the schools that we work. So some areas that we've found some solutions are in making sure that we ensure language is accessible to community members who are not research literate. And specifically in our written materials, we found that we receive feedback when sending out consent forms or talking points on a study that parents were not necessarily able to access the language because it was in technical research terms. And so we used site collaboration to ensure that that language was accessible. And then in relation to that, we made translations of all of our materials into Spanish, but then we ran into the same problem where people were giving us feedback that, okay, now the English versions are accessible, but the Spanish ones are not. So that was a second thing. And for screening our written pieces with native speakers in the community. And then lastly, dedicating time to coaching site liaisons to do outreach to community members and answer questions and get feedback about the study. So we've at least been able to mitigate for that first part of capacity with outreach to supporting site leaders to help do that outreach. And I know that this is a common problem, having been a teacher previously. Community access to information and really incorporating family voice into projects was a challenge I faced earlier too. So really curious to hear what solutions you may have found as well. So going on to the next slide, I'd love for you all to think about now, what connections do you see to your work and what solutions would you offer us? So I'll give you again 5 minutes to take some time for participants to complete this activity individually and then share out if they wish with the group. You can jot notes on your own, feel free to type in the chat as well, and then we'll come back together and discuss in 5 minutes. So at 3 after, and again, feel free to do this as it applies to your own organization, or if it doesn't apply to your own organization, feel free to offer us more solutions on what we mentioned. Actually, we'll go till 44 after. Okay, I am loving reading everything in the chat. Appreciate everybody's feedback here. Some of the things I'm noticing were, first of all, the idea of data forums and communicating the results back to our communities, and that's great, doing meaning making with people at the school or the site and community members. Also, the idea of doing continuous improvement cycles after to ensure that work is actually being done based on the results. And then I saw some good notes about incorporating data into newsletters to show which adjustments are made, or ensuring that that people are proximate to the work as well, and that there's ongoing community input. So I'm reading a lot of great things here. I see there's a question as well. The work is super critical, yet it seems likely to add time and cost to evaluations. Is this true in your experience, and are funders willing to pay for that? If not, are there areas you cut out to ensure this work can get incorporated? And I'd love to hear others' feedback. On our end, I know that one of the areas where we were feeling stuck is the capacity, and that is related more to time. I think in relation to the cost, it depends on how you work with your research partners, but for us, what we've done to avoid that is to just get very clear from the outset on what we are looking to do in terms of equity. And that draft that you've just read is us getting clear so that when we have our check-in calls with our research partners, we very naturally are able to guide back to those guiding principles. And so in my experience, it hasn't necessarily added cost, but there are capacity constraints. And I am definitely going to acknowledge that there's way more we could do on this front, and that I would want to do if we could have more space and time to devote to community outreach and those continuous improvement cycles after the fact. So I'm loving seeing all these suggestions. If anybody else would like to jump in, we have about 4 minutes to continue this conversation. So if you're brave, feel free to go off mute and share some of your thoughts of where your organization is feeling stuck or has figured something out. We'd love to hear from you. Also, feel free to keep writing in the chat. I love the suggestion, if the researcher isn't from the community, partner with someone who is from the community. And that is definitely a suggestion we take to heart and have implemented, and feel that it has helped tremendously. I see Jennifer wrote that she started asking school leaders what their learning objectives are, and might hold 1 or 2 of them as she collects the ones that relate to the broader work and bring them back up when they meet again. This relates, I think, to the collaborative research question generation as well as implementation protocols and practices. And we found the same, that when we're incorporating different stakeholders' voices, including school leaders, teachers, AmeriCorps members, and families into this process, we do get a lot more buy-in, and it actually facilitates the implementation after the fact. I love the idea Imani wrote, have people from the community work along with you and act as liaisons after you leave to discuss results in the community. And I think that is a fantastic idea. The more proximate we can get to the work, the better. And we have used family liaisons at certain schools, and it's definitely something we would like to roll out further. Well, this has been really helpful to see everybody's thoughts in the chat, and See one more question. Do you align school leaders' focus with your study in order to garner more buy-in? What if they are different? That's a great question. Not always. It's going to always be a collaborative conversation, but I think the key is more in the collaboration and conversation around these initial stages of research projects, because even if we don't go forward with the proposed research question from the other side or from the school leader side, just having that space to share their voices, it facilitates the relationship development side of the research that then makes implementation better. And it also helps if it's not possible to incorporate their research question, it makes us have more of a focus of where the learning should be going or what's useful to the site. And so that's part of the equity-based research shift, is we want to make sure that what we're studying is actually useful to the people who are being studied. Great, that was all really helpful. I feel like we could talk about this for hours, and so feel free to keep writing your thoughts in the chat, and we'll transition at this point into the next slide, please. I'll turn it over to you, Jade, to talk about more resources here.
Thank you all for your amazing participation in that exercise. It's just so incredible to see your insights. And somebody mentioned this idea of researcher positionality. I love that framing. Just had to comment that. So we're winding down and we're almost at the end of the presentation, but before we move into the Q&A, we want to share some resources with you. So these resources sort of serve as an extension of the conversation we've had today about equity-based research, and we hope that these will be useful in shaping your work outside of this session. Next slide, please. So we've created a Dropbox folder to house the resources on the previous slide. So I'm gonna put a link in the chat. Okay. So you can access these resources after the presentation, and we also really strongly encourage you to upload and share your own resources for the benefit of the group. If you don't have a Dropbox account, you can create one for free. It's very easy to access this folder. Next slide, please. So now let's transition into the Q&A. We just want to open it up to the group.
I'm glad some people are appreciating the interactive webinar here. We just know that we can get a lot of feedback from all of the expertise on this call, and so appreciate your interaction with us in this space. As I said, I wish we could have a day together to go deeper into all of this, but hopefully the resources provided in the chat will help people have more of a jumping off point. So I guess we have a couple more minutes if anybody has any other questions.
I'm looking back up in the chat at some of the, can you hear me, by the way?
Yes, thanks, Elliot.
Okay, I'm looking higher up in the chat for some questions that are interesting to address that maybe we haven't gotten to yet. I noticed Warren Combs, hi Warren, good to see you here, said, surprised that all question generation must come only from the bottom up. And I'm wondering if that's how that fits into your equity statement and what thoughts you might have about that.
Yeah, thanks. And I'm also seeing people are having trouble with the Dropbox folder. So we will definitely get that fixed. Just want to name that before I answer the question. So please save the link and we will get that fixed by this afternoon so people can access that. I apologize for that. But we'll appreciate your contributions there. Okay, so going back to your question, you said that in the research question development stage, having it be bottom up was a surprise. Is that correct?
I think that it was only bottom up. I'm not looking at your actual research statement. Maybe the question is about what's the interplay between bottom up and top down in terms of question generation.
Exactly. So when we say that, what we mean is really valuing the community members as equal partners in the work. And so it doesn't mean that they get to drive all of the research questions and choose them for us. It means that we're navigating funder priorities, our internal learning agenda, and what the community needs, and that the community members are equal partners in this work, who often have even more of a say because they are so proximate to the work that they know actually what matters most to look into and what's needed to understand deeper in order to further our work. So it's more about that initial phase being a collaborative process and a learning process together, so that all groups and stakeholders involved can arrive at a consensus on what the research questions should actually be.
Thank you. And I have one other question from earlier from Pat Fitzsimmons. Hi, also Pat, from the Vermont Agency for Education. How come teachers are not included in this statement? And she also wrote, collect feedback from site leadership, school leadership, families, and students involved in the study on the ways in which the research process made them feel heard and benefits of it, as well as areas of improvement.
Great, thank you for that feedback, because that is actually an oversight we intend to include teachers and do in our processes. So thank you for that call out. We'll have, as you can see, this is a working document, and so we've been constantly adjusting it, and I'm surprised we haven't noticed that before. But yes, teachers are also a key stakeholder. Our partner teacher relationships with our AmeriCorps members are very important, and in several of the studies I mentioned, when we've taken feedback, we've included teachers in that. So I think what it initially said was probably school community, and then that got parsed out. So appreciate that call out. Thank you.
Just want to respond to a question that Wendy posed, which is, can we have a way to reach Jessica and Jade if we have further ideas or questions? Yes, we really hope that you reach out to us. On the last slide of the deck, our emails are there. So please do reach out.
And I think we should probably stop with the questions there, just because we have a few wrap-up slides. Did you want to take a minute and do this, and then we'll move to the closing?
Sounds great. So thank you all for your questions. This basically concludes our session. This has been really incredible. So if you're able, we would love some quick feedback. So using the Zoom annotation tools again, we would love if you could just put a stamp under the emoji that best describes how the session went for you. And we'll give you a couple of seconds to do this. Wow, that's incredible. Appreciate the positive feedback.
We really appreciate your engagement in this work, and as Jade said, are happy to connect further, because it sounds like a lot of people on this call are trying to dive into this work in similar ways in their organizations. And so we would love to hear what's working for you, collaborate on challenges together. So please feel free to reach out to us.
Shall I move on, Jessica and Jade?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I think if people could just clear again, and they're perfect. Yeah, so here's our contact information, and thank you so much again for joining us for this hour. And we'll make sure to get the resources sent out to you. We'll
Absolutely.
work on fixing the Dropbox link, and then it looks like there's also a comment that we can send out some of the links as well. So we'll make sure we get those to you somehow. Thanks for your patience.
Great. Well,
Thank you all so
Jessica and
much.
Jade, thank you so much. It's really valuable, so valuable to hear about the work you're doing, and you shared with us an amazing group of strategies and tools, and also generated some discussion, which I think will have all of us thinking and improving our own work in the months and years to come. So this was incredibly valuable, and thank you so much. So I also want to Make sure everyone realizes that this will be available. We'll be sending you the link soon. So if you didn't capture some of the resources, they'll be there. To close out today's session, I wanted to share a little more information about our upcoming series on building the evidence base for personalized learning. This was the first webinar in that series. We have several more already scheduled, and you can find these on our website. I know you can't read them as quickly as this slide's going to be showing, but these are all on our website, aurora-institute.org. We're also, as I mentioned earlier, having the virtual symposium, excuse me, October 26th to 28th, and we'll be sending out more information about that soon. And we really look forward to seeing you all at the webinar series and at the virtual symposium. Once again, thanks so much to Jessica and Jade for this really terrific presentation. And thanks to everybody for your really productive, generous, and interesting engagement in the chat box. And we look forward to seeing you all soon. Thanks so much, and take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, Elliot. Thanks, everybody.